Well, this is a very special day and an opportunity to hear and reminisce about the presidency of David Gardner on the occasion of the publication of his new book entitled Earning My Degree. And we'll let him explain what Earning My Degree is about. This event and other activities today are co-sponsored by the Center for Studies in Higher Education, the University of California Press, which is the source of your book if you have a copy, the library, which of course will have copies of the book eventually, and the California Alumni Association. So several pieces of the Berkeley campus have gotten together in order to help this event come about. But I'm going to start off by turning the podium over to David Gardner. After mentioning that by count, he is the 15th president of the University of California. That occurred 1983 to 1992, as I think just about everybody in this room well remembers. Before that, David was the president of the University of Utah. Before that, he was in many positions within the University of California with the Alumni Association here on the Berkeley campus, at Santa Barbara, and as vice president for the extended university before he went off to Utah. Upon leaving UC, he became president of the Hewlett Foundation for 1992 to 1999, and until quite recently has been chair of the J. Paul Getty Trust. So David, we admire your book and we look forward to what you have to say about it.
Well, as I look out on so many friends, members of the family, acquaintances and colleagues of so many years, this is a formidable task today. Each of you know a little more about one part of what I'm presenting than I do, so please have some mercy on me later. But it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank Judd King and his colleagues at the Center for Studies in Higher Education for arranging this event. I appreciate it greatly. I hope we have a good time today. I am looking forward to it. The title of this book, Earning My Degree, Memoirs of an American University President, came about because of some family suggestions, but most directly as a result of my visit with the Berkeley faculty shortly after my appointment as president. I was visiting all the campuses of the university, and while there, I visited with the chancellors and administration, heads of the academic senate, heads of the student body, staff, other constituent groups, the media, and so forth. And part of that was to meet with the academic senate of that particular campus. So when I came to Berkeley, and I was introduced and I came to the lectern, as I am today, I looked out on the audience. I saw former professors of mine, several Nobel laureates in the first few rows, very distinguished scholars, scientists, sprinkled through the audience, some of whom I knew and others I just recognized. And I thought to myself, it makes no difference that I was a vice chancellor at Santa Barbara, or a vice president of the University of California, or had a professorship at both Santa Barbara and Berkeley, or that I was president of the University of Utah, or had just finished publishing A Nation at Risk, which was a major report on the condition of the American schools. None of that's going to make any difference. As I look out over this crowd, I'm going to have to earn my degree all over again from these people. So that's where the title came from. I almost feel that way today as I look out. So I'll do my best. Moving right along. Why did I write this book? I can't summarize it more easily than just by reading 2 paragraphs here. I might add it took 7 years, including all the research and writing. I did all the research and writing myself, pretty much, so I can blame no one else but myself for what's in this book. I was born just south of here in Alta Bates Hospital in 1933. I grew up at the end of Spruce Street, around the corner from Tilton Park, went through Cragmont Grammar School, Garfield, now Martin Luther King Middle School, and Berkeley High School with Bill Baker and some other people here. even some Piedmont High School graduate friends I see here. So, March 1933 was the year Franklin Roosevelt came to office as President of the United States, and Adolf Hitler claimed power in Germany. So a lot happened in the world, but a lot happened in California during the intervening years. There were 83,000 people living in Berkeley, 1933. There were 6 million people living in the state of California. I don't know what Berkeley's population today is, and it's not clear what population California possesses. 37 million plus or minus 2 million, depending on how you count. So I wanted to use my own life over this period of time, particularized to the universities with which I've been associated, as kind of a surrogate for what occurred, and to raise issues that still are pertinent and of interest and of relevance to today's situation. So I hope these memoirs will, among other things, help to illuminate California's recent past, inform the present, and anticipate the future. I had my eyes LASIK'd, but they were partly successful. Inform the present, anticipate the future by recalling the verve, boldness, confidence, and risk-taking that characterized those who went before us and on whose shoulders we now stand. So that's a general statement. For the University of California, it is my desire to help those responsible for its present and foreseeable future to remember what made the University of California the world's greatest public university and one of the most remarkable and renowned centers of learning ever known. To forget the past or to neglect its lessons risks UC's future, for it is an institution that is at once vulnerable and fragile and yet remarkably resilient and adaptive. It is also at the very center of California's educational, economic, civic, social, and cultural aspirations, and therefore uncommonly susceptible to political and sectarian pressures, threats, promises, and enticements of one kind or another. The academic and intellectual principles on which UC's strength rests, and which I seek in these memoirs to explicate and defend, are those on which all the free universities of our civilization have depended for 9 centuries. They need to be recalled, to be refreshed, to be remembered, to be honored, to be sustained. They are not to be surrendered or relinquished, point by point, incident by incident, or bartered away for short-term gains, or because they're not inconvenient to defend, or because of fiscal exigencies, donor pressures, political threats, or promises. No. They are to be advanced, defended, explained, and employed in the university's service, costs and penalties aside. And we should be reminded that our predecessors in the Western world, from the 12th century on, somehow managed in the face of complacency, indifference, ignorance, hostility, or despair to raise the university's lamp high enough to illuminate not only the university's sense of its own purpose and future, but also its link to a more broadly civilized and cultured society. Fiat lux. So that's why I'm really writing this book. Whether I succeeded or not is for you to decide. I, of course, have been helped tremendously in this effort by the Secretary's Office of the Regents, by the Executive Records, University of California, by friends and colleagues and their papers, by the University of Utah, by the Secretary of Education for the United States government, and other sources of material, including several boxes of my own that I found to be very helpful and very useful. I also rely on my memory. I know that's a scary prospect, but in some cases, I'm the only person still living in the conversations to which I make reference, so I do the best I can here. No one, around to counter it, but I still do my very best to be honest and straightforward about it. So I'd like to thank that. Now, I'm going to move quickly through the structure and content of the book, and then I'm going to come back to 3 points, and then I'm going to sit down. The book consists of 10 chapters. The first deals with my growing up in Berkeley, university life, my service in the Army, which was an interesting experience as I was in our intelligence services in the Far East for 2 years in an undercover position. Graduate studies at Berkeley, marriage to my late wife, Libby, the coming of children, and my work with the California Alumni Association. The second chapter deals with the apprenticeship years, by which I mean my time at the University of California, Santa Barbara, during the period 1964 to 70. Well, that was a tough time. It was not only at Santa Barbara it was a tough time, but Santa Barbara had its share. Berkeley had its problems. All throughout the University of California, it was a national phenomenon. I learned a great deal. And I'm not going to quote very much, but I want to quote this because I can't state it any more succinctly. This is what I learned coming out of Santa Barbara, where we'd had almost 3 years of unrelenting protests. Students were killed in the course of this, thousands of people arrested. The campus disrupted, the university library emptied 150 times because of bomb threats and so forth. So it was really a tough time. Everybody had answers for us. The governor had answers for us. Our alumni had answers for us. The students had other answers for us. The faculty had answers as well as questions. And the media, they had their own interests. So this is what I learned from those experiences because I was right in the middle of it. And this is not necessarily a popular recollection of those years. So that's okay with me. This is my view of it. During the protests, and I'm referring not just to Santa Barbara here, but principally, during the protests, the lives of thousands of students were stimulated and invigorated. But the lives of thousands more were bruised, battered, harmed, and bewildered, and often enduringly. The professional careers of capable, long-serving, and often distinguished academic administrators and some senior faculty members were also prematurely concluded, often under sad and unforgiving circumstances. Because of these protests, the politics of the state changed. The attitudes of the California public hardened against the university, and the norms of academic life were fundamentally and permanently altered. Whatever the gains, the costs were dreadful, and yet rarely mentioned, it should be added, as the recollections of these times have come to be memorialized in mostly self-congratulatory assertions, as unbalanced as they are unaccountable. Those indelible events remain etched into my consciousness and burned into my memory. I learned how very much alone the person is who carries decision-making authority under conditions such as those we confronted. How confident and unforgiving the views and judgments of non-combatants and Monday morning quarterbacks can be when they know nothing of the facts and the real world with which we were dealing. How reluctant most faculty members are to get mixed up in matters of this kind. How readily students believe the worst of authority and the best of those challenging it. How easily misled the public and how willingly misleading the media. I came to recognize how important it was to have advisors who would speak their minds, how crucial it was to explain decisions to all interested parties in a timely and open manner, and how an administrator working under these conditions and looking for any acknowledgement of a job well done would be as well advised to go buy a dog. Or so my friend Derek Bach told me at the time I was retiring from the University of California in 1992. On the more positive side of the coin, I learned once again that the political center of gravity fits between the opposite ends of the political spectrum, and how crucial it was, therefore, that the center hold during times of stress. Otherwise, the pressures from the opposite extremes will weaken the center and thus destabilize the consensus of views and opinions upon which rest the means of settling disputes and managing or resolving conflict. That most students, faculty, staff, alumni, and the public were well-intentioned, even when misled, and that you simply had to work harder to gain their confidence. That persons of goodwill could be very much at odds one with another. That to reconcile differences without compromising either of the contending parties or those whose counsel and advice you had sought and whose judgments you respected was crucial, and that there's a difference between finding an answer that satisfied and the discovering of a solution that worked. That after most controversies had ended, there's a rush to penalize the innocent and reward the guilty, and that the world at large is not nearly as rational as those within the academy prefer to believe, and of course, neither are they. So those are my impressions leaving Santa Barbara, and I came up to serve under Charlie Hitch as a vice president of the university at age 37, so I was still learning. And I learned a lot of lessons from Charlie Hitch. He's a great guy. I don't have time to go into all of that. I then went to the University of Utah, and one chapter deals with this in its entirety, and I served there for 10 years, 73 to 83, but given the nature of this audience, I'll simply say it was a 10-year honeymoon there. And I'll move on to the next, which was hardly a honeymoon. That was coming back here. Okay, then back to the blue and gold. That's the title of my next chapter. And I will just combine reference to that chapter with the next one, which is the workings of the university in the crucial first year. This deals with a profile of the University of California in 1983, when I came as president. What did it look like? Number of campuses, range of programs, the size of the student body, the size of its budget, its endowments, the nature of its operation, so forth. I then indicate that I suggest in this that there are 8 reasons for the University of California's rise to eminence. They're describable and they're discrete. And so I've laid those out for whatever they're worth. Those are at least my opinions about it. I discuss at length the governing and management structure of the university. I talk about the fiscal problems we confronted. Someone said, how can you move from a university with $275 million budget to one with $5 or $6 million budget? I said, well, that's no problem. You just change the numeral at the front and add 3 zeros. That's no problem. The problem's not the budget, the problem's funding. That was the problem we had. We'd had 8 years of Governor Brown and 8 years of Governor Reagan. Each, for their own reason, had chosen not to be overly generous to the University of California, if I may understate it. And for completely different reasons. Governor Reagan tended to view the university as a place where persons who could not afford the private universities of the state could go. Almost an extension of the welfare program of the state. Governor Brown didn't dispute the excellence of the University of California, nor did he condemn it. He simply said, if you want to be excellent, you'll have not to do it on the state's money, to get some more money from other sources to do it, which of course is what we've been doing for decades, and we still are doing in spades today. But sir, both those reasons, different reasons, we were really hurting. So I have a section of this that deals with what happened between March of 1983, when I was appointed, the appointment to be effective August 1 of the same year, when in March of 1983, 2 weeks after I had been appointed, Governor Duke Magian announced that the state was going to pay its creditors with IOUs. I remember thinking to myself that I must not have examined this problem sufficiently. I must not have done my due diligence sufficiently. In any event, from then until 15 months later, when our 1984-85 budget came out, with a 32% increase in our operating budget from the state. So the series of events that led to that outcome, I deal with in this book. I know Larry's going to comment on it. I'll be happy to answer any questions about it later. Then I discuss the relations between the president, the regents, the vice presidents, the chancellors, the academic senate, the student body, the staff, donors, alumni, and so forth, and all those constituent interests. And my first meeting with the Board of Regents, which was memorable, I think for all of us, because we set the groundwork for our relationship over the ensuing years. I can come back to that if you're interested. There was a new governor, and I recount my relations with Governor Duke Magian and how we came to be working together in the university's interest. He was a tremendous governor and was a great help to the University of California, I can tell you. And then the reorganization of the university administration at the president's office level. So those two chapters deal with that. Then I moved, after we got the money, then we began to move again. So then there's a discussion of the university on the move. That's a new chapter. The construction of the Keck telescope, the 10-meter optical telescope, the largest in the world, atop Mauna Kea in Hawaii, with Caltech, which is, recounts one of the most bizarre fundraising events in the history of American higher education, but we got it. The enrollment of minorities and what happened during my administration and how we sought to deal with that opportunity as well as problem. An average of 1% increase at the undergraduate level of minority enrollments for each year we were here, steady increase. The creation of the Graduate School of International Relations Pacific Studies at UC San Diego. The expansion of the Education Abroad program and research opportunities and travel opportunities and study opportunities for our faculty across the Pacific Rim. I always regarded the Far East as our near West, as Bob Scalapino knows. That's my view. I think it's our near West. You look out the window, it's not our Far East. You know, we're looking to New York for that. Look across the Pacific, that's our near West, and so we need to take account of that. Then with the creation by Chancellor Kohl of Germany, of the Center for German and European Studies, that was a particularly delicious event because we beat Stanford out for it. And our attempts to improve the quality, character, and attention given to undergraduate education in the United States, and in the University of California, and Neil Smelser chaired a very important committee that addressed that issue. Then, the next chapter deals with bumps and barriers along the way, of which there were a lot, and I just chose a few. University-state relations, that's mostly relations with the governor and the legislature. I could write an entire book on that. Animal rights and AIDS research. Our move to Oakland, the president's office, various lawsuits that were of general interest. Any given time, I think I had 150 lawsuits against me at the university. But we had very capable general counsel. They took care of most of them. Hate speech issues, various propositions the people of the state undertook to favor, affirmative action matters, ethnic politics, weapons labs, California Public Interest Research Group and how it collected its money from UC students, where I had some marked disagreements with Ralph Nader. Divestment of interests in South Africa in our portfolio. Protests of one kind or another, so forth. So I detailed these and go through them and explain how these really worked, who the players were, what the pressures were, the politics of it, how it was dealt with, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The next chapter deals with public and diplomatic life. Most people don't know anything about this, but the reach of the University of California across the world is remarkable, and its influence is very significant. And so there's a network of relationships to service on a regular basis. And I give life to those and expression to them in ways that I think will make for a very interesting chapter for people who are not acquainted with this aspect of the work. Chapter 10, I titled Tragedy and Tribulations. It was a mix. My late wife's death in 1991 and the corresponding decision I made shortly thereafter to step down as president tied directly to that. Growing budget problems as we entered into the 1990s. The state went into a recession not experienced in its depth except during the periods of the Great Depression. This offered us a lot of problems. The retirement controversy when I left, I addressed that at some length. I'm happy to comment on any questions you may have regarding that subsequently, but let me say on that just briefly, and not defensively, but just descriptively, that when we fix student fees, we do so in part by reference to comparative public universities in the United States as to what they charge their students. It's not determinative, but it's considered. When we fix staff salaries, we tie it to the annual survey of state employees and the private sector within the state of California. When we fix faculty salaries, assuming we have enough money to pay all this, We pay the average of the leading 4 public and the leading 4 private university compensation for faculty. So when we fix administrative salaries, we do the same thing. We have a comparative group. And so that's what we do. And I'll deal with this. I'm coming back to this in a minute. And then the last part of that deals with my sense of the accomplishments of the university during my administration, not all of which, of course, are attributable to me, but which occurred on my watch, as well as the problems, which I dealt with in great detail here. And the comments of others on my administration, and my own personal views about my own sense of what was accomplished. And the very final chapter deals with it's an epilogue. It deals with my marriage to Sheila Rogers. Sheila's here today in 1995. And her patience and encouragement throughout were critical to the completion of this book, and I wanted to acknowledge that. My work at the Hewlett Foundation, working with Bill Hewlett, he was a great man, and it was a great privilege to work with him. Chairing the J. Paul Getty Trust in Los Angeles was an experience, and I was a trustee there for 12 years as well. I remain involved and detailed this in various higher education issues around the world, and teaching and writing, consulting and advising. And the very last part of it deals with reflections on what, in my view, was really important in life. So that's the last part of it. I want to return now to 3 things, and then I'll conclude. The best thing that happened, the worst thing that happened, and the most important thing that occurred. The best thing that happened was to get off to a good start with an increase in our operating budget of 32%. How did we come at that figure? Because that's what we'd lost cumulatively over 16 years under Governors Reagan and Brown. Instead of trying to get it back over 10 years, we decided to get it back in 1 year. The book will describe how that happened. Larry Hirschman will have some comments on it as well, I suspect. In short, Governor Magian and I hit it off. And he was persuaded that the University of California should be made fiscally healthy again, and decided to do it overnight. And that was the result of a 2.5-hour luncheon in Los Angeles, the meeting at his request. And neither one of us had really known one another before that. It's quite a remarkable outcome. I could spend 30 minutes talking about the politics of this, but I'll leave it for your Q&A and for Larry. I might add that when Larry Hirschman and Bill Baker came to see me in Salt Lake City about this budget, they were doing the 84-5 budget. This was in August of '83. This is for the ensuing year. They've been working on it for 18 months, and they suggested that, well, we ought to have a budget increase at least for 84-5 of 3%, which is what the chancellors had been encouraging. They thought that was good because we've been getting a lot less than that. They thought that would be a reach in some respects. Larry and Bill both suggested maybe 5 to 7%. And the longer I thought about it, the less I was enthused about any of those options. And I thought, I can spend the next 10 years here getting back what we lost, but that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. And besides, I can't get this place rolling again if we don't have the money. Faculty salaries were 16% below the comparison group, for example, at that point. This is not good. University of Utah was recruiting out of the University of California. It ought to tell you something. Therefore, I resolved to try and get it in 1 year. Did I have any idea how I could get it? Not the foggiest idea. But I was reminded of a visit I had with the provost of American University of Beirut, when the University of Utah, which has very strong ties to the Middle East, had convened a conference at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio. And we were talking about our problems, and he talked about his at the American University of Beirut, which is during their Civil War. He said, well, the left came in to see us and said, if you don't close the American University of Beirut, this imperialistic outpost with this corrupt culture and character, we will kill you. Then the far right heard about this conversation. They came in and said, you've got to keep this place open. It's central to the future and progress of Lebanon. And if you don't keep it open, we will kill you. So I said, well, what'd you do? I was thinking at that point, student newspaper articles and alumni complaints aren't too bad. So I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, we sat around the table. We decided, well, if we're going to be killed anyway, we'd rather be remembered for having been killed trying to keep it open than trying to close it. So I thought to myself, when Larry and Bill were there, and this actually came into my mind, I guess I'd rather be killed trying than not trying at all. So that's essentially what drove it at that point. You can fill those in later. The second had to do with my retirement. There were 4 problems with this retirement. Anybody remember that here, by the way? The timing was awful. The state was in an economic downturn. People were losing their jobs. Universities' budgets were terrible. It couldn't have been worse. Second, there were resentments within the Board of Regents, among and between certain regents. Not about me, but among and between certain regents, and I became an instrument for expressing those resentments. I get it later if you want, but that's what it was. Third was the complexity of the compensation plan. It consisted of 3 parts: salary, benefits, and a deferred compensation arrangement. This was completely in line with the compensation paid to people around the country doing what I was doing. That was not really an issue. But the deferred compensation, which was complex, and people who don't work with these things find it hard to find their way through. I found it hard to find my way through because it was driven by the tax code in many ways. And the tax code changed in 1986, so did the regents' form of compensation for their chancellors and president, vice presidents. So it's extremely difficult to explain this to the interested party, including the media. Actually, what we should have done is simply eliminate the deferred compensation, add it to our base salaries, and we'd all been better off because it had been in our retirement plan. So it's not such a hot outcome. And finally, it was mishandled. And I attribute most of that to myself. This is mishandled. Very hard for me to talk about my own compensation. So it wasn't handled very well. So those 4 things contribute. If you want to hear more about it, I'll be happy to respond to your questions. And finally, what was most important? What was most important was the standing of the University of California in 1992 when I left office. And I want to rely on somebody else's comments on that. Okay. I had worked very hard to bring all 9 campuses along, not just 2 or 3 or 4. Worked very hard to do that, to be as even-handed as I could, to be as helpful as I could be to the newer campuses without in any respect diminishing the ones with greater capacity and strength. And I think I succeeded at that. I don't mean I in a singular sense of the term, but during my administration this occurred. What's the evidence for this? Well, as President Kerr and Peltison have noted, with the report of the National Research Council, 1995, the evidence is in that particular document. In Volume 1 of Kerr's Memoirs on the University of California, he devotes most of his final chapter to a review and analysis of this report and related reports. No other American university campus, and I'm quoting now, have advanced faster in the course of the entire 20th century than Los Angeles and San Diego. Another way to view the general level of distinction among universities, he points out, is by the percentage of programs ranked in the top 10. Then he goes on and points out there's 4 campuses at the University of California there. Well, that's been occurring over an extended period of time, not just during my nearly 10 years of administration. But what I wanted to mention, and do so in closing, is that if you use the National Research Council's report, it's a reputational report. There are other ways of judging the excellence of a university. And one of these is the per capita receipt of federal research and development funds and the per capita publication rate in leading scholarly journals. Kerr reports that nationally, among the rising public universities, UC Santa Barbara ranked first, UC Riverside and UC Santa Cruz were 4th and 5th. UC Irvine is 7th, and UC Davis is 15th. That's a remarkable outcome. 5 of our university campuses are members of the AAU, American Association of Universities. Finally, in Webster and Skinner's analysis of the National Research Council's report, the University of California system is described as astonishing in the breadth and depth of its quality all across the campuses, not just at 2 or 3. And I'm going to end these remarks with this quote. And I express by reference to individuals, people to whom I owe a special debt. Then I go in a more collective way. In this, I've always been keenly aware of the contributions not only those with whom I worked, but also of those remarkable men and women who went before. Of the 59 persons who served as chairman or vice chairman of the Board of Regents since 1920, and the date of my retirement in 1992, of the 59 persons serving on the board, I've known 53. Of the university's 18 presidents since 1869, I have known 8. I mean, I don't include myself in that. I know 8 others. Of the university's 49 chancellors, I've known 45. Of the 29 members of the faculty who chaired the Senate's Academic Council and who represented the voice of the faculty at Regents meetings, I've known 20 of the 29. The students I came to work with number in the low hundreds, and 312,404 students earned their degrees at UC during my tenure. And as president of the University of Utah, another 55,000 roughly. I tried as hard as I could to meet the high standards my predecessors set and to contribute in ways that befit my responsibilities. I believe that I largely succeeded, but certainly not in every respect, as these memoirs make clear. And with the benefit of hindsight, and when I wrote this at nearly 70 years of age, well, I'll be 72 this month, I grow increasingly aware that the uncertainties and vagaries of life and work inform our biases, enliven our sensibilities, enrich our possibilities, and make our triumphs and our sorrows all the more poignant. What a privilege it was to have served the cause of higher education with memories and a sense of accomplishment that subordinate the bumps, barriers, and crises along the way. And thus life moves on. And to be able to read this in the company of so many friends and colleagues who've been so devoted to the University of California and so helpful to me is a very special opportunity. And I appreciate your coming. And I'm sorry for a somewhat rambling presentation. I'm really better in a Q&A than doing this. And I'll look forward to that and the comments of my colleagues here. And thank you very much.
I will give only a very brief introduction of each of our panelists, since you probably know them rather well already. The first is Neil Smeltzer, University Professor of Sociology.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you reflections on 5 events or issues, maybe it's 5 stories, all of which I was involved in, but involved in intimately with David, and each one has a moral.
I'm in trouble already.
The first, in 1971, I came across David Gardner's book on the loyalty oath. I was doing research on my own on the history of the University of California, and that I was getting myself into that literature, and it was a very unsatisfactory literature, written mainly from partisan points of view, people's viewpoints during the time. Everyone was at one another and had the right answers. And here's shining through as this kind of very objective, dispassionate, reflective, eloquent scholarship. It's one of those moments where you really see a scholarly mind at work. And it shaped my thinking on the whole issue of conflict in the University of California. It was a prophetic book in the sense that the qualities of his own analysis were later to become qualities in action that governed his behavior and conduct in all the positions he subsequently held. He didn't write it as a prophecy about himself, but you can't help your own personality, and it showed up in this book and in a way comes true in David's subsequent life. Story number 2 is in a way the same story, but it's also a different story. It has to do with David's experience in Santa Barbara, which he mentioned and spent a little time on. This was a very, very rugged period, encompassing at the very least the Bank of America building burning and the Isla Vista riots, as dozens of other incidents that were politically really fundamentally unsettling. He was propelled into the center of these events as a very young man, partly because of the inexperience and distaste for dealing with them on the part of his senior administrators, and partly because of his own and unusual skill. Once again, the trademarks of his style as president emerged: to listen, to digest, to analyze, to confront honestly rather than deceiving antagonists, and above all, to be cool and rational in a scene that is fundamentally hot and often uncontrollable. I have to tell you that I was personally glued by these accounts and became a kind of blood brother with David once again when I read them, because I played a similar role on the Berkeley campus in 1964 with acting Chancellor Martin Meyerson. That was another time when the university was on fire and reeling after the free speech movement and getting into the anti-war period. The whole works was unfolding at that time. These are horrendous moments for those governing the institution, and they survive only by patience, perseverance, straight-arming and occasionally outsmarting enemies and critics on all sides, and not being overcome by despair. These are remarkable pages in these memoirs, and I recommend them to you most strongly. Now, I want something that's a little more remote, and I don't think David knows about this exactly, so prepare yourself.
Yeah.
In 1986, John Vasconcellos, who was a very powerful man in the Assembly, was riding his self-esteem horse very hard. He was arguing that the state of California should take responsibility for the self-esteem of its citizens. And he got the Commission for Self-Esteem established, and among other things, in his enthusiasm, he approached David Gardner and asked him what the university might do to help him in this cause. David turned this request over to Bill Fraser, a physicist, who panicked. He had not heard of self-esteem. And Bill Fraser turned it over to Cal Moore,
Cal's here today.
a mathematician, who in turn panicked and turned to me. What could the university best do to deal with this request? I panicked as well. But I thought about the matter, and I said, well, why don't we do what we can do best? Why don't we take these 6 areas where John Vasconcellos thinks self-esteem matters, like chronic welfare dependency, teenage pregnancy, alcoholism and drug dependency, and so on, and let's get 6 of the best people in the University of California, the scholars, the faculty, to really make an assessment of what kind of role self-esteem as a variable, as a cause, plays in these areas. Let's do it as a university would do things. Well, this won the day, and ultimately a book called The Social Importance of Self-Esteem came out. As a matter of, I'd picked up that this was an item of state long before this, and included John Vasconcellos as editor of this volume, though he didn't. Also, I asked him to write a chapter saying how the Self-Esteem Commission came about. I thought it would be a little interesting sideline to the book. Well, he sent me an essay, which was, I can only describe as a lurid biographical account of his own psychic life, with, I believe, some sexual details thrown in. There's where the panic really came in. And in panic, I called David up. I said, David, we have a problem. David said, Neil, you have a problem. That's what I call administrative style. Well, I worked with Vasco for about 3 months, really in a hand-wrestling mode, pulling every professorial influence I could possibly do, and finally got the thing down to an unembarrassing level, and it came out. On this episode, I came to appreciate yet another of David Gardner's skills. I don't know what word to use on it, but I will have to confess to you that the word manipulation came to mind. Well, forget that. Let's say he's a master of interpersonal adeptness. Story number 4 is my experience with David during the period of the season of undergraduate educational reform, which he referred to. He once again asked me to take responsibility for chairing a major commission in this area, which was a very important episode in my own life. What I came to appreciate in David at this time was, from the very beginning, he expressed full trust and confidence in me, and he let us proceed independently and without interference. And he was also completely generous when the report was brought before the regents, calling me in twice to give full and lengthy presentations and to be in the center of discussions or really seminars on the topic, and in addition giving full credit to me and the commission. I think at one time it crossed my mind during an especially heavy interchange I had with State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Bill Honig, that he was personally glad that I was front and center in this enterprise, but I never queried him on this point. This is another side of David's administrative style, which involves substantial delegation to those he trusted and his steady support of them throughout. I don't think I've really expressed my appreciation in exactly that way. Finally, number 5 is not a story, but really an account of the lengthy experience I had in working with David when I was vice chair and chair of the Academic Assembly and faculty representative of the Regents in the late 1980s. This was a beautiful working relationship that he had with the Senate, and I was representing the system-wide Senate at that time, so we met frequently on all ranges of issues. We were of like minds, so that always helped. And I also had an opportunity to observe David's style in the Board of Regents. I mean, here was a place where he was in complete command, and in command in such a way that he did not alienate the regents, with a couple of important exceptions, but by and large it was a miraculous kind of importance. He was extraordinarily effective, and he got his way most of the time, or at least fashioned compromises that were acceptable to him and to others. He did so, moreover, by this rationality, persuasiveness, respect, intelligence, and analytic ability that showed up in his very first scholarly work. He was a model president in that regard, and it's a privilege for me to be able to say this on the day that we receive and honor his memoirs. Thank you.
Next, Larry Hirschman, budgeteer of the university for much of the last century, and here today reliving the days of 32% budget increases.
Gee, sometimes it feels like that, actually. I want to start by saying that a former regent of ours made the comment that the most important job the regents have is selecting the president of the university. And I want to say I agree with that. And I've worked for 6 presidents of this university. I think every one of them has been the perfect president for the time that they were president. And I think it's unbelievable that almost that the regents have been able to select just the right person for the time. And as I've reflected quite a bit on the nature of the individuals, the governors they've had to work with, it's been remarkable. And, during my 37 years, I've seen what David Gardner has said here about the growth and development of our campuses and the quality of every one of our campuses. And, you know, I can remember like it was yesterday, 37 years ago, and what the University of California looked like. And you can just take Santa Barbara or Irvine or San Diego, you can go on, and look at what has happened to each of those campuses and how they have developed and the quality. And I think our presidents have had a lot to do with that. Clearly, the university is the faculty and the students and the staff, but presidents are important, and they make important decisions. Now, just a few facts I'm going to put out there, and then I'm going to tell 3 stories myself, since I can't resist. But just a couple facts, because I'm a budget person and I can't resist some facts. Okay. David Gardner's term as president, the university's state budget doubled. It went up 60% in the first 3 years. 60% in the first 3 years. So it wasn't just the first year, and I'm going to come back to this because we wound up doing a multi-year plan. Federal funds doubled. They grew at a rate of 10% a year, which was phenomenal. Private funds tripled. We're doing a little report here for the Regents looking at 1970 on in the university, and we had questions at the last Regents meeting, and so I pulled out a lot of these, a lot of this data, and I think it was a remarkable period, and I must say, as one who participated in it, we loved that period of time. It was great. More money is better than less money. Jerry Brown was wrong. Less is not more. More is more. Student enrollment. And I'm going to tell a story about this one, but the projections were we weren't going to grow at all during the 1980s. We weren't going to grow at all. We grew at 2 to 3% a year, 25,000 student enrollment growth. David told a story about faculty salaries. I'm going to come back to that one. We went from 16% behind to catching up in 1 year. It was unbelievable. My finest moment in the university, and I'll come to that in a minute, just as one individual watching that happen. I mean, it was incredible. Capital outlay. We had essentially no state money for capital outlay for 10 years. There's Bill Baker. He went through every single one of those years. If we got $15 to $20 million, it was a miracle. $15 to $20 million. And just before David came, it was down to 0. And by convincing George Duke Magian that bond financing was a good thing, debt, the state got started with a lot of debt. And they've done a good job with it, I must say. But we went to bond financing, and our capital budget became $150, $200, $250 million a year. Student fees, there was virtually no growth in student fees. All this state money, and the state was rich, and they felt they could afford to buy out fee increases. That wasn't all good because it led to some other things later, and I'll come to that one. Okay, so I want to tell a couple stories. The first one, and David mentioned this, this had to do with the first year, and we had come through some very tough times. I must say the late 60s and early 70s were particularly tough. During the early Jerry Brown years, we sort of had workload budgets, and then after Prop 13, things deteriorated. So we were way behind on faculty salaries and everything else. And David talks about his efforts with respect to the meeting in Utah and what went on after that. And I must say that the consensus in the university, the chancellors, the faculty, the consensus was we ought to be cautious. We had been through some tough years. We ought to be cautious. Bill Baker and I thought we ought to be a little more than cautious. David Gardner risked his whole presidency on not being cautious. That's my view. He risked his whole presidency on this. And that we ought to go for it. And as time went on during that fall, and we started to go into our budget hearings with the Department of Finance, we thought rather than just going for 1 year sounded good, let's go for a 3 or 4 year plan. Let's really deal with all of the issues here, including faculty salaries, including basic money for the university for equipment and instructional computing and libraries and capital outlay and money for maintenance, something as mundane as maintenance, and research support. I mean, we were hurting in all of these areas, and we developed a 3-year plan. And I must say, in every single year of the Duke Magian administration, we were able to work out a budget every single year. We were the only entity in the state that tried to work with the governor and come up with a budget plan. Everybody else was fighting. We worked with the governor, and some of us learned some lessons from that, even to this day, that I think are critical. And as I said, I think my best moment in the university in all 37 years was when the Department of Finance called to tell us what was in the governor's budget. And Bill Baker and I went up to see David Gardner and said, "You won't believe this." And there it was. And I must say, to this day, there's never been a moment that I've had in the university that even came close to that moment. The second one, and I notice Sandy Smith is here, and so is Cal Moore, and I can't resist talking a little bit about enrollment. Every time the university develops an enrollment plan, it turns out to be a disaster in terms of what if you wanted to predict what would happen, it would be almost the opposite of whatever we planned for. We had worked really hard for years to come up with an enrollment plan before David came, and an academic plan for the university. And the great projections that we had in the early 1980s were no enrollment growth, flat for a decade. David Gardner came in, and I think this was either his first Regents meeting or one of the very first Regents meetings when he was president. And Bill Fraser got to present this plan to the Regents, and I'll never forget this. Poor Bill Fraser, he lays out this plan for no growth, and David Gardner says, "I don't agree with this plan at all, and I'm not going to support it, and I don't want the Regents to support it, and we're going to come back and come up with a new enrollment plan for the university." And what happened, as you all know, big enrollment growth, the planning for 3 new campuses, and we're finally going to get Merced opened this fall, and it was a phenomenal period. All of that enrollment funded, and it was, there's some lessons over here about planning, I guess. Sandy could probably tell you afterward about them, but I think from our point of view, I think one would say that you've got to have some policy views here with respect to admissions, in addition to just sort of straight standard projection methodologies in terms of determining where you're going. Now, my third story has to do with David Gardner, the university's budget director, and president. I must say David Gardner spent enormous amounts of time looking at our budget and deciding on budget strategy, and he got to the point where he knew the budget better than maybe everybody in the university. Maybe I was comparable, but I doubt if anybody else was. In any event, we'd have an hour meeting that Bill and I would schedule for him. It lasted for 2 hours. Poor Nancy Nakayama, it lasted for 2 hours. Then we'd have another meeting the next day for another 2 hours, and maybe a few more, and because he wanted to be absolutely sure we were doing the right thing. And I must say, the chancellors, the academic senate, everybody trusted David because they knew that he paid attention to this. Well, my little story is as follows. Every year when we negotiate budgets with the state, we have a hearing with the Department of Finance, with the director. And presidents always make an opening statement and talk, they present an overview of where we want to go. And then the rest of us take over and go through the details and justify the budget. One year, David Gardner decided he was going to do the whole thing. And he did. 2 hours. 2 hours. The whole budget, every issue, answered every question. Maybe we answered a couple. I don't remember, Bill. Maybe you'd remember. But he basically did the whole thing. And so Bill and I got to the point where we called him the university's budget director. And at least it stuck with us, I think, because I must say, he spent an incredible amount of time on it. And, just to end up here, those were great years, got lots of money. There was enormous growth in the university. The quality of the campuses improving dramatically everywhere in the university. And then the end was tough. We were headed for budget cuts. I must say, when we finally had to sustain those cuts, I think we were able to weather the storm much better because we were in a better position. Our faculty salaries were competitive, et cetera, et cetera. Our fees were very, very low, and we could cope with fee increases at the time, and we had to do that. But I would suggest that it was through the kind of effort that we had with the Duke Magian administration in the good times that allowed us to cope with the bad times. And finally, on the retirement system, and I know how controversial this is, continues to this day right now in terms of Sacramento and Washington for that matter, if you want to look at Social Security, through the good management of the retirement system, we've had no employee or employer contributions for 15 years now, something like that. We were able to handle an early retirement program for the university because of the assets in the system, and that became critical in terms of our coping with the bad times that we went through in the early 1990s. So my parting remarks are where I started. It's a great university. It's been great for me for all the decades I've been there, and I must say, as I started with, presidents are important. And this one was very important to the success of the University of California. So I want to thank you.
Next, Carl Piester, longtime Dean of Engineering at Berkeley campus, Chancellor of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Vice President for Education Outreach.
Thank you, Chud. In listening to my colleagues, I am reminded that while we're still aspiring to be a diverse university, we are a university of diverse perspectives. And I hope my perspective complements, with an E, those of my colleagues, maybe with an I also. Sorry, it must be too late in the afternoon. I want to make a couple of observations about reading the book, and then, as my colleagues have done, cite 4 incidents briefly. I first met David, I think, in academic year 72. At that time, I was one of us, and he was one of them. And among faculty colleagues, you understand that the us people are the people doing the work of the university, and the them are the academic administrators, whose relevance will come up in just a moment. In my first example, I had the pleasure of reading this book so I could get prepared for my remarks last month, or at the end of last month, and I do my reading of this kind of literature along with Crichton and other Grisham, just before I go to sleep. And normally it takes me about 2 months to read a book. I read David's book in a week, and my wife can attest to that if you wish. Interestingly enough, I found in reading the book that I was having a conversation with David. And that's an unusual experience to have a conversation with David because, as many of you know, he doesn't speak in complete sentences. He speaks in complete paragraphs. And that's my sense of reading his book, and that's why I was attracted to it and stayed awake to do so. The second general reflection, and I'm going to criticize David here, I don't think he really spent enough time talking about his interaction with the chancellors. That's, of course, a very self-serving statement. But I do remember those Council of Chancellor meetings down in the Kaiser building. 9 chancellors, and David and his vice presidents typically, sometimes not. And you can imagine, 9 chancellors, no one has to tell a chancellor, you're not speaking enough, you're not really saying what you feel. Well, David, an issue would come up, and 9 people would be speaking about the issue. one of the very tall chancellors frequently got up and stormed out of the room. And made the grand entrance later on, the southern branch has its problems. So David would patiently listen to these 9 perspectives, and then at a certain point, and he had this timing just down, he would say, well, I think this is where the issue is, and he'd beautifully position the issue, and everyone would think that he was on their side, or his or her side, and that would be the end of it. A remarkable, and I saw this, of course, again with the Board of Regents. He was fortunate in he had, I think, a group of regents who were somewhat more friendly to the office of the president than, well, I'll leave it there. Let me say something now about the 4 quick comments. The first one I found on page 164. It's the University of California Précis and Profile, and David makes this statement. The university does not welcome much management and regards the exercise of administrative leadership, in quotes, as an oxymoron. Well, I certainly concur with that statement. He goes on to say, its internal affairs are exquisitely balanced within a well-tested and much commended system of shared governance. Then he goes on. The thing that I really question there and would seek to find a different adverb is exquisitely. I was thinking frustratingly or inertia-laden or once again, it depends on whether you're an us or a them. And as an us, and Mike Heyman will remember this because I was an us under Mike at one time before becoming a them with Mike. The faculty is forever saying, you want us to make decisions and you don't give us enough time to do it. These terribly important decisions that we have, we're supposed to do teaching, you don't give us enough time. Whereas the administration is saying, my God, the faculty protocols for making decisions are of infinite duration. Each issue is an open question, and not until too late do they come back. So that's a tension that exists in the university, the oxymoronic character of administrative leadership in shared governance. The next issue, which occurs on page 174, I think is another interesting challenge for a president. And this is under governance and management structure, balancing authority. And the paragraph starts out, the role of the president of the University of California is pivotal to the sustainability of UC as a single institution. Then he goes on to elaborate on why it's pivotal. This is an extremely well-kept secret on the campuses. It's just amazing that if you ask the average faculty member, and particularly at Berkeley, I might remark, what's the role of the president? They'd be hard pressed. That's like getting a 400 on the SAT. The answer. So that continues to be a dilemma for a president and for the faculty on a campus. Not to mention a chancellor of a campus. The next is a much more supportive comment, and that occurs, and David has already mentioned this, and as has Larry, the incredible importance of David's really rash and utterly irrational commitment to increasing the university budget in his first year in office at the level that he wished. And Clark Kerr noted in his foreword to David's oral history that he basically says, and I'm just going to paraphrase, this was the most important thing that David did. It saved not only the university at the time, it saved us in the 90s again when the budget crisis hit. If we had not had that, God help the university. The next comment I want to make has to do with something that David has alluded to briefly, and that has to do with what happens to friends. No good deed goes unpunished kinds of friends. When he asked me to chair the task force on the faculty reward system, in 1990. There's a missing fact in the process that David didn't include that I'd like to remind him about. Some faculty felt that this was not a task force on the faculty reward system. It was a task force seeking to destroy the excellence of the University of California because it didn't sufficiently celebrate the singular and exclusive importance of research in the proper work of faculty. Well, when that report was submitted to David, he and Bill Frazier, who was his academic vice president, dutifully submitted the report to the Academic Senate, the Academic Council, which in turn passed it down to the University Committee on Academic Personnel, UCAP. Well, UCAP, I am told, and this is secondhand information, I don't have the primary source, I am told that UCAP deliberated some 20 minutes on the report and said, that's fine, it's filed, and that's the end of that. Well, thanks to, in my view, thanks to David's persistence after I don't know how many thousands of dollars that were spent in preparing that report, David said, well, if they don't like it, we'll publish the report. So he had Bill Frazier publish 10,000 copies of the report and send it to every faculty member in the system. And that created a furor on all the campuses, which lasted for the next year. And it did have some noticeable effect on the academic personnel process. Finally, this is an observation about a comment that David has made. And this is in the bumps and barriers along the way, and I must say we're still very much bumping along this road. This has to do with undergraduate admissions. And it's a dilemma that we're facing. It's a constraint on our admissions process in the university that is absolutely devastating our goal of achieving a class of students in the university that is representative of the high school graduating class, not to mention the ethnic and demographic composition of California. And he says that we were not just admitting individual applicants. This is, of course, long before SB 1 and 2 or Prop 209. We were admitting a class that under our policy and consistent with the master plan and prior legislative resolutions was not to mirror but to encompass, to take account of contemporary California social and cultural diversity. Alas, all of our private competitor institutions admit a class of students. We cannot. We can only admit individual students on a one-by-one basis. This problem, I think, confronts the university in the most serious way today. So I'm glad that paragraph's included, and I hope people, particularly I hope people on the board will read this. Thank you.
Finally, Wilson Smith, Professor Emeritus of History, University of California, Davis.
Thank you, Judd. I have not been on the inner circles and the inner councils of this institution, except for once when I was chair of the academic council for 2 years. And so I feel I'm an outsider. Of course, he comes from Davis, so naturally he's an outsider. But we look upon this whole time of David's presidency, I think everyone does, as not only important, but an exceptionally good and healthy time for the university. My experience was in 83, 84 as vice chair, then 84, 85. And when I was chair and when it came to the divestment controversy, I was heroically flat on my back with a slip disc. So Marjorie Casario, the vice chair, will face the music in the council on the divestment issue. I'm an historian, maybe the reason I'm here, not of the university, but of universities in general and of higher education in this country. So I'd like to talk with you about this genre, if that's the right word for it, of memoirs, biographies, and autobiographies of college and university presidents. It's a growing industry. Industry may be the wrong word, but David's is something new and different, which I'd like to explain to you and go back first to tell you about some of the others. I think the most comprehensive one is from a neighbor, Donald Kennedy at Stanford, who calls his book Academic Duty. And I think that's a sober enough title to fit the way Don Kennedy thinks about things. And it's a very, very insightful book. Next one I'd mention, I think, is probably Frank Rhodes at Cornell wrote a book which I think most people think should be better, but he does talk about liberal arts and how they might be better taught at the university, in such a large university as Cornell or any other large one. The ones I like, and I think anyone likes, are because they are candid and personal. Ted Hesburgh, Father Ted Hesburgh at Notre Dame, written 2 books on his experience there, and these are captivating books. The next one is Jill Conway's at Smith College. Jill came out of the outback of Australia, as you may know of that book, and had an interesting and fascinating career making her way to this country and going to Harvard, marrying a Harvard professor, teaching for a while up at McGill, and then coming down to Smith College. And she's recited all that in the third of a trilogy of books which he's written, which are good reading. I guarantee you, if you don't like the history of higher education, believe me, this is the soft way into it, Jill Conway's works. Next, I'd mention Henry Rossofsky's. That's a problem for me because, as you also may know, Henry Rossofsky was the famous dean of the faculty and of liberal arts at Harvard, who turned down the Yale presidency in order to stay at Harvard. No one thought anyone could possibly do that, but Harvard people think that automatically is the right thing to do. He wrote a book about Harvard, and it's a little bit disappointing because it's so impersonal, unlike David's book. It's almost the exact opposite of that, and it has some good matters in it, which are well explained, but I would not put it at the top of the list. The last one I'd mention to you is, in some ways, my favorite now after David's, is Bart Giamatti. Now, Bart, as you may know, was president of Yale. He was the son of an English professor at Mount Holyoke College, came down to Yale and was Sterling professor there, and they chose him as president. Bart's love was always the Boston Red Sox, and that was what counted in his life. He taught for at least 15 years at Yale, then went into the presidency there for 4 or 5 years. But when he was offered the commissionership of the National League and then the other American League, and then finally of a commissioner of baseball, he accepted it gratefully and enjoyed that job very much until his untimely death. The one thing I remember from Bart's book is a visit with a congressman representing New Haven. Bart went down to see this fellow on important university and educational matters. He waited in the anteroom. Finally, a statuesque blonde came out and ushered him into the congressman's room and study, and the congressman greeted Bart effusively and said how glad he was to see him. And then he said, now it's time for a photograph. So the photographer came in. The congressman put his arm around Bart Giamatti, and they smiled. And the camera was clicked, and the blonde came back in and said, now your time is over, President Giamatti. And that was the end of the interview with the congressman about important matters. That's the kind of thing you run into, and it's a scarce literature. There will be more, I'm sure, not so good and some a lot better than others, but it's a range of literature, if you want to call it that, and of memoirs, biographies, which are well worth looking into, especially if you're spending your life in higher education. Now to this fellow here on my left book. Two over, right, yeah. I don't like nonfiction books or biography that don't have some humor in them. Dave tells us that when he first went to University of Utah, he was told by his secretary that the president of the university always visits the football team in fall practice before they have their regular games on the practice field, and it's customary for the president to do that. He would be expected to do that. So Dave asked the secretary for a roster with pictures of the team, and he went out to the practice field. The coach blew the whistle and Dave introduced himself to the coach, and the coach blew the whistle, and the team came over with one burly fellow in the lead, and Dave looked at him and said, "How do you do?" This fellow said, "How do you do?" Dave said, "Are you Steve Odom?" "Yeah, I'm Steve Odom." "Well, that's great, because you went to Berkeley High School." "Yeah, I went to Berkeley High School." "Well, so did I. I think that's fine." And Odom said, who the hell are you?" Well, I usually put on a green eye shade and a critical voice with this kind of thing when I review books, but I have to say that I admire not only the man as the way I've known him, but the candor in this book. If you have bought the book, you're lucky. If you should buy it simply because it's the kind of writing, even though it's about one institution, which is exceptional. I won't say that there is a lack of immodesty in it. It is self-assertive and is confident and buoyant, as Dave himself is, and you don't find that usually. Most books about academic life, if they're not fiction, there is good fiction, as you well know, about academic life, but the nonfiction usually is third-person, analytical, and dry, if not easily passed over. But Dave's book really invites you into it because he is so confident. And it's unlike anything you heard him say at the beginning of this session. He was just rehearsing the chapter headings there, but you get the taste of the man by reading this. I like his candor for, well, several instances. First of all, he faces up to Ed Carter, this brusque old, very cagey regent of the university, in his job interview with the regents. And Ed Carter said to him, "So I understand you're a Mormon?" And Dave said, "Yes, I am." And there was a silence because they expected, he assumes, for there to be more questions about this. But finally, Dave allowed us how this question is entirely impermissible. If you know what the Constitution of the state is, in the presidency having being not tied with any kind of religious or political restriction. He goes on to win over Ed Carter over the years, and this was not easy to do when Ed wasn't sleeping during Regents meetings. And he finally gets strong support from Ed for one of his first what was it? Reorganization plans, which is the kind of thing I don't pay any attention to and should have, but it's good. It was a good structural proposition for the university, and Ed told him that he hadn't seen anything like it in the way of a managerial statement since he'd been on the board of regents. Next thing I like about is Dave's relationship with Willie Brown. Speaker Brown gave President Gardner a difficult time when Dave went over to the legislature and was interviewed and gave testimony about affirmative action. There were some very hard words passed, at least for that kind of subject. And in the words of Bill Pickens, who was there, which Dave repeats in the book, Willie played the race card and about prejudice and against blacks, and Dave answered saying that he knew about prejudice because of his Mormon ancestry and what that had meant to his family in the past. But what Pickens doesn't say, Dave, and what I remember because I was there very clearly, is that Willie said, "You don't have the color of my skin, so you don't know what it means. Well, how can you answer that? I thought Dave had a rough going over, but he stood up very well in that. Now, the point of telling you this is because over the next months and years, Willie Brown came to the support and defense of David in more ways than one. The one I do remember is that an open hearing of the regents, when the salary business was being discussed, there were hoots and hollers and jeers from the audience, as you might expect. It was an open meeting. And the regents said nothing, which I thought was puzzling and unfortunate. I didn't think David had to say anything, certainly. But amid the hoots and jeers, finally, Willie Brown spoke. He said, "That is a contract." And that quieted the naysayers. After that, I know that David says that he and Willie got along rather well. Another thing I like about the candor of the book is that he answered one legislator at the end of a meeting by saying, the legislator had come to him and said, "So you're expanding the UC empire?" And David gave as good an answer to that in about 5 lines of words in his book, as you can imagine. You buy the book and look it up what he said. Finally, on faculty teaching, the faculty, gets a lot of bumps as everyone else does. And on page 238, I'm going to read you these 7 or 8 lines. David writes, "It's simply wrong to assume that the faculty are not interested in their undergraduate students. Wrong to suppose that research is their sole interest. Wrong to believe that only monetary incentives are needed in this area of the university's work. And mistaken to think that some overarching bureaucracy is needed to oversee and guide such initiatives. The way of the academy is not the way of the world. That is why these institutions need to be overridingly self-governing rather than subject to the less informed and more coercive nature of government's many forms and facets." I could say a lot or more, but we'll stop at that. Thank you.